everyone. My name is Max, the Technical Support Associate at Dubility, the makers of SurveyCTO. In SurveyCTO, web forms are a way for anyone to fill out a form using any device with a web browser without using the SurveyCTO Collect app. Web forms can be a major part of data collection, such as for projects where travel to conduct interviews is not feasible, enumerators are not necessary, and more. In this webinar, we will review how you can customize web forms in your data collection workflow. At the end of this webinar, we will have a Q&A. So if you have questions on anything we have discussed, post it using either the Q&A feature in Zoom or in the Zoom chat, and we will get to it at the end. If I am speaking too quickly, you can also use the Zoom chat to ask me to slow it down. At the end, I will also share with you a list of resources so you can learn more about the features we have discussed, as well as a feedback form so we can get your thoughts on this webinar. This webinar is part of our Safe People and Data initiative, where we work to adapt data collection methods from in-person interviewing to methods that protect everyone involved, providing the safest environment possible. We've had a few presenters in our webinar series who've come to speak to us about how they're adapting their data collection. For example, we've had a webinar on the move to phone interviewing known as CADI, and CADI has become important to many users. If you're able to contribute to the initiative in some way through offering resources for others, or if there's something you're interested in presenting, feel free to let us know. To learn more about the initiative, take a look at the website or get in touch with us via the email address on screen. There will be 4 main parts to this webinar. First, we will briefly discuss what web forms are and when you can use them. Next, we will talk about various web form settings, including customizing the look of the web form interface, turning off certain features, and even setting up the web form to automatically load in the respondent's preferred language. After that, we will talk about how to distribute web forms, send them to your respondents, use URLs to identify respondents, and restrict access to web forms so only certain respondents can complete them. Finally, we will discuss how to create web forms, where we will review features you can include in your web forms to make them easier to complete, and how web forms can automatically retrieve data about the respondent. First, let's talk about what SurveyCTO and web forms are. If you're a veteran SurveyCTO user, this will be more of a refresher. SurveyCTO is a data collection platform for creating forms and collecting data. You can create forms using either our online form designer or a spreadsheet application such as Microsoft Excel. With those forms, you can set up skip logic to skip unnecessary fields, validations to make sure the entered data makes sense, repeat certain fields when necessary, and so much more. Those forms are then filled out using either our mobile application, SurveyCTO Collect, where forms can be completed offline, or using web forms, which is the main topic of this webinar. Web forms are a way to fill out forms using a web browser with no need to download any additional applications. Web forms have many of the same features as the SurveyCTO Collect mobile app, the most obvious being that either can be used to fill out forms. Additionally, just like in SurveyCTO Collect, in web forms, you can start forms over, change the form language, go to the next field by swiping, and so much more. We will go over the features in detail a bit later. The greatest advantage of web forms is that they can be completed by just about anyone, whether or not they are familiar with SurveyCTO. Just send the respondent the link to the form and they can fill it out at their leisure. This makes web forms great for COWI surveys, or computer-assisted web interviewing, since no enumerators are needed, with respondents completing the form on their own. Web forms can be filled out either on a desktop computer or a mobile device, so respondents can easily fill them out using their smartphones if they prefer. We'll show you examples of both a bit later. There are many advantages to web forms that respondents complete on their own. They can be more cost-effective since there is no need to hire and train a team of enumerators. There is also no need to schedule an interview since the respondents will fill out the form whenever they have time. Self-enumerated web forms are also more private than in-person or telephone interviewing. Some forms ask very sensitive questions, such as about drugs, history of abuse, and thoughts on controversial subjects. Respondents may not feel comfortable talking about those subjects out loud. They can feel more open and honest completing a form on a computer than they can speaking with an actual person. The main disadvantage of web forms is that the respondents must be connected to the internet while completing them, so be sure to keep that in mind. There is no one-size-fits-all style of web forms. Let's talk about the different web form settings you can customize. Generally in web forms, there are options to change the form and interface language, start over, jump to the start and end, and more. Let's take a look at an example web form. This is the web form view with most of the settings turned on for a logged in user. It is designed to mirror the experience of completing forms using the SurveyCTO Collect app. Most of the settings we are about to discuss can be turned off or hidden. Up here, you can save the form in case you would like to complete it later. Next to that, we have the options menu where you can validate your form to make sure all fields that need to be completed have valid answers, skip the field you are on so you can return to it later, clear the responses on the current page you are on, start over to erase all data entered so far, or return to the list of available forms in the main menu. Someone's asking if we will share the presentation. Yes, we're going to share the recording in a few days. I'll talk about that more at the end. Next, we have the width, where you can change the width of the view. Currently, it is set to the default width, but I can make it more narrow or more wide. Up here, we have the form language. We will discuss this more a bit later, but for now, you can see that if I change the form language to French, it changes not only the language of the form, but the language of the interface. The Save Form button becomes Enregistrer le formulaire, please forgive my pronunciation, and everything else is translated as well. Next to that, we have the username of the logged in user. In the form itself, I have buttons that can bring me forward and back, and skip to the end or the beginning. If your form includes groups, either regular groups or repeat groups, the top will show the respondent's current location in the form. For example, our current location in this form is in a group with the label Group A. Here we have the Go To Prompt menu. In this menu, numerator can see which fields still need to be completed and also skip ahead or back to different fields in the form. By default, whenever you display the value of a visible field, called a field reference, it appears as a hyperlink. For example, I will give this field the value 1001. In the next field, I have a field reference to that field, so it displays its value. If I click on that field reference, it brings me back to the page where I entered the value of that field. Someone asked a question we're going to talk about more at the end, but feel free to continue to post your questions in the Zoom chat. This can be helpful for forms where respondents might need to complete the form in a non-linear way or easily jump back to fields where they accidentally entered incorrect information. Again, a lot of these informations can be turned off, which we will discuss a bit later. This is an example of that same web form opened by someone without a SurveyCTO account, called an anonymous user. The interface is a bit more simple. There is no Save Form button, and there are fewer options. And there is no button to log in. Here is an example of that same web form on a mobile device. It looks very similar to the web form on desktop, except the buttons on the sides have been removed, and most of the menu options have been moved to the 3-line menu in the upper left here. Most of these menu options will not be available to anonymous users. This is just for logged in users mainly. You can also navigate the form by swiping back and forth. Just like in SurveyCTO Collect. Nearly all of the settings can be customized for each form. Let's take a look at some of them. Form collection settings are managed from the Collect tab of your server console. Let's go to the settings for the form we were just looking at. Web form example features. To change the settings for that form, go to the form, click Settings, and the Change Form Settings menu will open. At the top, we have Allow Anonymous Form Access, which may be the most important setting we will discuss. When this setting is turned on, it allows anyone with the URL to complete the form. That way, respondents do not have to log in to complete the web form. This is turned off by default, so be sure to turn it on before starting data collection. Next, we have the Auto Detect Browser Language setting. If this is turned on, the web form will load in the language of the web browser. I'll show you an example. In this web browser, I have cleared all cookies and set the default language to French. If I go to that web form from before by pasting in the URL, it automatically loads in French. That way, respondents don't have to worry about changing the form language since it will automatically load in their preferred language. If I were to turn this off, then the form would instead load in its default language. For example, since the default language of the form was English, if I turned off the setting, then the open form and then opened the form in a French web browser, it would still load in English. Because of that, we generally recommend keeping the setting on. Below that, we have Allow Nonlinear Form Navigation. You may recall that the go-to prompt menu from before, where the respondent could skip to specific fields in the form. You can turn that off in similar settings from here. Next, we have the Show Location Within Group setting. Remember before how it showed the label of the group, Group A, at the top of the field? You can turn that off from here. By default, web forms use the default width on desktop web browsers and the narrow width on smaller mobile devices, such as smartphones. Here, you can override the default width so it appears more wide or narrow. This will only change the appearance on desktop devices, not mobile devices. The Allow Start Over setting is quite straightforward. When this is turned on, there will be a menu option allowing enumerators or respondents to clear all data in the form. You can set this to on, off, or only logged in users. The only logged in users option can be handy for forms that will be completed by both trained enumerators as well as layperson respondents. That way, enumerators can start over if needed, while respondents do not start over by mistake and lose the data they have entered. The Hide Login option setting is also straightforward. If this setting is turned on, then when a form is being completed by an anonymous user, the login option in the upper right will be hidden. That way, there will be less for respondents to worry about, and they will not think they have to log in. Next is Disable Swipe Navigation. Given the dominance of mobile web browsing, more forms and surveys are being completed on mobile devices. We demonstrated earlier how you can use swipe gestures to move between fields instead of needing to tap a button. Generally speaking, this works quite well, but when a form has lots of fields on the same page, respondents are more likely to quickly swipe up and down, and they could accidentally swipe to the next field by mistake. If you're worried about this happening, you can set Disable Swipe Navigation to on. Finally, we recommend that you ignore Use Legacy UI option, unless we advise otherwise when you are receiving support. As mentioned before, you can change not only the language of the form, but change the language of the web form interface and have the web form language change based on the web browser language. You can add form languages to your form design and add web form interface languages from the Configure tab of your server console. We actually did an entire webinar on how to set this up. At the end of this webinar, I will share the link to that webinar. Let's go over a few different scenarios where you can use web forms. We will go over 4 different forms with 4 different sets of web form settings, and we'll go over which settings are turned on or off each time. We will start with a market research form, which will have the most settings turned off, so it will have the simplest look for respondents. We will end with a form for computer-assisted telephone interviewing, or CATI for short, which will be completed by enumerators, and therefore most of the web form features will be turned on. At the end of this webinar, I will share a chart showing the settings for each form. This is a basic market research survey. In this scenario, the form administrator would post a link to the form, maybe on their website or a social media platform, so anyone can find and fill it out. Because this will be completed by random respondents on the internet, we want this to be as simple as possible. I know that personally, when a website asks me to complete a survey, I don't really want to think about it that much. A web form that anyone can complete should be as simple and easy to use as possible. Most of the features in this web form interface have been turned off, making it as simple as possible. All I really have are the buttons to go back and forth, And the form allows anonymous users, that is, users who are not logged in, to access it. If we look at the settings to allow anonymous form access, auto-detect browser language, and hide login options are turned on. So anyone with the URL to the form can fill it out. It will load in their preferred language if available, and they will not be confused by any login options. Everything else has been hidden since we don't want the respondent to be able to skip around the form or be distracted by options they don't need. This is a web form for a job application. This form is intended for potential candidates for a job, so respondents are more likely to be really paying attention and less likely to be confused by other features. Still, this is going to be completed by respondents who are not necessarily familiar with completing forms in surveys like this, so we want to limit the number of web form features. Here, I turned on the hyperlink field reference setting, so respondents can click on field references to go to that field, which I demonstrated earlier, but I'll show you again in a bit. Also, when the respondent is in a repeat group, it will show the name of that repeat group. Finally, this form also allows the respondent to start over in case they entered too much incorrect information and they would like to start again from scratch. This form is set up to show the label of the repeat group of the current field. Let's take a look at what a repeat group label can look like. I'll first enter some initial information into this form. Here, we are in a repeat group that repeats once for each job the respondent previously had. At the top, we have the repeat group label, job information. This is actually a dynamic field label set up by a calculate field. I'll show you what I mean. I'll enter information about this job. For the position title, I'll enter data analyst. And for the company name, I'll enter Awesome Analysis Inc. Take a look at what happens to the group label at the top when I go to the next field. The group label changes to the name of the position and the name of the company. That way, as the respondent continues to enter information about being a data analyst at Awesome Analysis Inc., they can look up at the group label to remind themselves which job position they are entering data for. This is one example of when it is helpful to include repeat group labels, but use your best judgment on when to include it or not. When you turn on the hyperlink field references setting, you can click on field references to go to that field. I'll show you an example. In this field, the job title and company name are also included in the field label being displayed using field references. Because the hyperlink field references setting is turned on, field references are hyperlinks. So if I click on one of them, I am brought back to the page where I entered that field's value. That way, if the respondent sees that they made a mistake, they can simply click on the field reference, which will return them to that field so they can fix the data they entered. This form has some more cool features, so feel free to deploy it to your server. Give it a try. Also, fun fact, when I first applied to work here at Dubility, the online assessment I took to gauge my skills was a SurveyCTO web form. So online assessments are another great use for SurveyCTO web forms. For a form with more features turned on, we have this form, which is part of a study on small businesses. It will be filled out by respondents who will be instructed a little bit on the platform so they can complete the form well. Here, the Go To Prompt menu is turned on, so the respondent can skip to another field in the form if they need to. Let's take a look at an example. I'll first enter some basic information into this form. For example, here, the respondent is asked how many full-time, part-time, contract, and other types of employees they have. If they do not immediately have that information, they can click the Go To button here, and then they can use the Go To Prompt menu to skip ahead to a different part of the form. When they try to submit the form at the end, they will be brought back to the first incomplete required field, and they will have to complete all required fields before submitting the form. The Go To Prompt menu can be a bit overwhelming for a layperson, which is why we generally recommend leaving it off for forms that will be completed by the general population, as well as in forms where you do not want respondents to be able to skip ahead. Finally, let's take a look at a form that will be completed by enumerators. Generally speaking, when a form is being completed by an enumerator, we recommend using the SurveyCTO Collect app. However, if your enumerators do not have a mobile device, it is too expensive to provide them with a mobile device, or it is simply a lot easier to use web forms are still a great option. This form uses the default web form settings. If I open it as a not logged in user, it says the form is private. That way, not just anyone can complete it, only logged in users. It has all of the standard web form features, including jump to start, jump to end, the go to prompt menu, and other features that are exclusive to logged in users, such as save form and validate form. It is a good idea to instruct your enumerators at least a little bit on these features so they can take full advantage of them. When setting up your web form project, consider who will be filling it out and turn on the settings respondents may need, and simplify the experience by turning off the settings they will not need. Let's talk about how to distribute SurveyCTO web forms. It may seem a bit out of order to talk about distribution before creating web forms, but there are a few things to keep in mind about distribution while you're creating your forms, so we'll discuss this first. Forms can be completed either by going directly to the form's URL or by using Web Collect. If the form is going to be completed by anonymous users, then you will need to share the URL to the form. To retrieve the URL to the form, go to the Collect tab of your server console, scroll to the form, click Share, and the URL to the form will appear. You can share that with anyone who will complete the form. You can also right-click, Fill Out, and select Copy Link Address to retrieve the URL. Logged in users can also use Web Collect. To access Web Collect, go to the URL, your server's name.surveycto.com/collect. For example, the name of this server is Presentation. So to access Web Collect, I'll go to presentation.surveycto.com/collect. Then all the enumerator has to do is enter their credentials. Here, the main menu will have many of the same menu options found in SurveyCTO Collect. If there are cases, it will say Manage Cases. You can also view a list of all deployed forms and fill them out using Fill Blank Form, continue a saved form and edit saved form, and remove saved forms from delete saved form. If you have your own website, you can also embed web forms into web pages. That way, the respondent can fill it out right from your website. Just by the way, I see a lot of people asking questions. Please continue to ask questions. I'm going to post them. I'm going to answer them all at the end at the Q&A. If you have your own website, you can also embed web forms into web pages. That way, the respondent can fill it out right from your website. Here, I have embedded a web form directly into this support article so users can immediately see what this form looks like. You can also use third-party services such as MailMerge to send out links to forms in bulk and customize the links you send out. We don't have time to go over that here, but you can learn more about it in our support center. You can also identify respondents before they even start the form by using unique links to forms. You may have noticed that whenever you go to retrieve the URL to a form, it always ends in !case ID equals. Anything you add to the end of that URL will be saved in the form in a field called case ID. For example, if the URL ends in 1001, then the value of the field case ID will be 1001. I'll show you an example. I have opened the small business form from before in the test view where we can take a deeper look at the form. If you look at the URL to the form, the case ID is set to 1001. On the right, I can view information about the form, including the values of hidden fields. If I check the value of the field case ID, It has a value of 1001, just like in the URL. This can be a great way to know who is submitting the form. Later, we will discuss more uses of unique links. All right, that is an overview of how to distribute your web forms. Be sure to check out the resources I'll post later to learn more. You can also ask more about web forms when we get to the Q&A at the end of this webinar. Now, let's talk about some features you can include in your web form design to make them easier to fill out and more likely to be submitted. If you are already familiar with form design, then designing web forms will be easy. You can use either the online form designer or use a spreadsheet form design. We don't have time to show you how to create a form, so if you have never used SurveyCTO before, you can check out our quick start guide, which will walk you through how to create your first form. We will share a link to that at the end. When you first deploy a form, it will be private, so only users on your server, such as data collectors, can access it. So be sure to turn on Allow Anonymous Form Access so anyone can fill it out. You can also change the other web form settings to fit the needs of your project, as discussed earlier. Because web forms are more likely to be completed by respondents, it is important to make them as engaging as possible. Let's go over some great features you can include in your forms that are especially good for web forms. Respondents often prefer having multiple fields on the same page of the form. You can set this up in your form by adding a group with the field list appearance. Here, these two fields, name and age, are in the same field list, so they are on the same page of the form. As you may have noticed, you can also display fields in a table like this. You can learn how to set this up in our documentation. This looks really nice on a wider desktop. However, more and more forms are being completed on smartphones. This is a screenshot of that same field from before on an Android device. Because a smartphone is not as wide as a desktop monitor, the header "Not Available" is partially cut off, and the header "Other" is completely cut off. In cases like these, it may be better to use a normal or select multiple field without the table view, as shown here. Even though the respondent may have to swipe more to get to the other fields, everything fits and is a lot easier to see. However, a field list table can still be a great addition to your form. If there are only 2 or 3 choices, or the choice labels are really short, like here, where they're just numbers, then the table can work really well. Here, since the column headers are a lot shorter, the table fits comfortably on the screen and it looks great on a mobile device. Keep in mind that you will not receive any form data until the form instance is submitted by the respondent. For that reason, if you have longer self-enumerated forms, it can be important to add checkpoints where the respondent can end early. That way, if the respondent does not want to continue, you can at least receive the data they did enter. This field asks the respondent if they would like to continue. If they select no, all fields after that are not relevant. So they are skipped, and we get to the end where the respondent can submit what they have. If the respondent selects yes, then the respondent can continue the form like normal. It is good to add these every so often so the respondent has the option to end early and you can still receive the data they entered. You can also add progress bars to your form. This is a great way to give the respondent a good idea of how much time is remaining. For example, in this webinar, we are currently on slide 18 of 22, which is about 86% of the way through, which gives you a good idea of how much time we have left in this webinar. Adding these progress bars to your web forms are a great way for respondents to get a good idea of their progress. Images are a great way to keep the attention of your respondents. Here, each choice in this choice list also has an emoji to accompany it, giving it some nice color and design to our web form, improving the experience of our respondents. You can also add field plugins to your form. Field plugins are a way to change the appearance and behavior of your fields. In this case, instead of a basic select one field, where the enumerator selects a choice, we have an image of a human body where the enumerator can click on the part of the human body that hurts. For example, if you're testing the side effects of a vaccine, you can ask the respondent to click the part of the body where they ache. This is just one example, but there are dozens of other field plugins you can use, which you can learn more about in our field plugin catalog. Keep in mind that you will not receive any data until the form instance is submitted to the server. It is a good idea to add a reminder at the end of your form asking the respondent to submit the form on the next page. Before, we mentioned how you can use unique links to give the case ID field a value. You can take this even further and use that unique identifier to retrieve information about the respondent. In this form, the first field asks if the business name is correct, even though the respondent has not yet entered any data. This form uses the case ID value as a unique identifier to retrieve information from a preloaded set of data. This form retrieves other pieces of data as well, such as data entered in the baseline server, which is later displayed to the respondent. Later, feel free to deploy this form to your server with its server dataset and play around. You can also check out our guide to unique links in our support center to learn more about how this works. As we mentioned before, when you turn on anonymous access, anyone with the URL to the form can access it. While this is usually enough to make sure only the intended recipients complete the form, sometimes you want to add some extra security measures, but without giving the respondent SurveyCTO credentials. There are a few ways to set this up. As previously mentioned, this form uses the case ID in the URL to retrieve information about the small business, such as the company name. But it has another purpose as well. Watch what happens when I change the unique identifier to 100, which is not a unique identifier found in the preloaded data. When I try to move forward, I get a warning that says an invalid URL was opened. This note field is only relevant when the URL does not contain a unique identifier or when the unique identifier does not exist in the server dataset. This field is required, but is a note field, so it does not take any data. Because of that, the respondent cannot move forward until they go to a valid URL. That way, if someone goes to the base URL to the form, they cannot fill out the rest of the form. You can also include a sort of password in your form. As you can see here, the third field in this form asks for the password. If we enter the wrong password and go to the next field, a note field appears saying the password isn't valid. In this form, there's a field called password that uses the unique identifier stored in the field case ID to pull the small business's password from the preloaded data. This field here has a relevance expression where it will only appear if the entered password does not match the password retrieved from the server dataset. This note field is also required, so the respondent cannot move forward until a correct password is entered. That way, if the URL to the form is shared or stolen, the form still cannot be completed without the password. If the password is also stolen, it is easy to change the password in the server dataset. Lastly, before we move on to the Q&A, I would like to tell you about the next event in our webinar series, which will be on case management. A case can be a household, a farm, a single respondent, or just about anything else. If each case requires multiple forms, specific enumerators assigned to them, longitudinal studies, or something else, case management can be a great option. Join us on June 2nd. Keep an eye out on the SurveyCTO blog for more details.